Welcome to a special episode of The Partial Historians. Today we are going to be speaking to someone local, Professor Ray Laurence from Macquarie University, although unfortunately we were not able to meet up in person as we had planned because of a lockdown that was taking place in Sydney at the time of recording. We hope that you enjoy listening to Ray share his amazing knowledge of what life was like in Pompeii before the eruption. And if you do enjoy this episode, please consider becoming a Patreon so that you can get early access to all of the bonus episodes that we are working hard to produce for our wonderful community of listeners. However, if you are not currently in the position to become a Patreon, then please support the show by spreading the word any way that you can. Thank you and enjoy. Welcome to another episode of The Partial Historians. I am one of your hosts, Dr. Rad.
And I'm Dr. G.
And we are joined by someone who is being very special to our podcast today, Professor Ray Laurence. Ray Laurence is a professor of ancient history at Macquarie University in Australia, but before he worked in Australia, he was Professor of Roman History and Archaeology at the University of Kent in the UK. His work is based in archaeology, history, and classics, and it's characterized by a cross-disciplinary aspect that causes it to be accessible to architects, landscape historians, geographers, and urbanists. He has published books and articles on urbanism at Pompeii and across the western half of the Roman Empire. In addition to this, Ray Laurence was one of the pioneers who worked with TED Ed to produce animated videos and lessons, including A Glimpse of Teenage Life in Ancient Rome, which has had over 10 million views, and Four Sisters in Ancient Rome, which has had over 8 million views to date. And the real gold star on his resume is that he has been a big supporter of our show, of course. But today we are going to talk to him about streets and public space in Pompeii and how children fit into this society.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ray. I'm going to get us started with a sort of a big question, which I think will open up the space for lots of conversation. From your perspective, what are the biggest misconceptions that people generally have about the urban environment of Pompeii?
I think the big one is, and it's still kicking around, that this is a lovely little resort town down by the sea, and everybody doesn't really do anything, and it's terribly lovely, whereas in actual fact, it's quite horrid. The other thing is that it's so badly built that, I mean, if you look at any Pompeian wall, if a builder built you a wall like that, you'd actually want your money back because it is really shoddy. And I mean, you sort of look at it and go, well, it's not really built to last. And then we excavated it and it's been out in the rain for 200 years. And we're thinking it's going to stay up. And that seems a little odd, really. So the idea that there's great architecture there, I think that's one misconception. And if you wanted to see lots of lovely marble all over the walls and things like that, well, Pompeii is not the place to go to. There's hardly a marble column in the whole place.
So we're not talking about a place that has a lot of monumental architecture by the sounds of it. We're talking about something that's a little bit more gritty, a little bit more down to earth.
They've got lots of monuments, but I mean, all those lovely columns, they're all got plaster on them. It's rather like sort of a bit of a stage set. So it looks like it's actually, they're very good at making imitation marble. And so they have public monuments and lots of public buildings, but at the same time, they're doing it quite cheaply. I mean, it's not like the stuff in Rome where you actually see, yep, that's solid marble. That's a great big lump of stone. That's not really happening. that stuff's just not what they're using. So that's one thing. I think the other great misconception is that one of the things which we say, we look at the forum and say, isn't that a typical Roman forum? In actual fact, it was built before the Roman colony was set up. So it's an Italian forum, but we always say that as typically Roman in terms of proportions. But in actual fact, that concept was sort of kicking around in Italy in Italian towns as well as in Rome itself.
Yeah, that's right. There are so many different groups that have influenced the development of Pompeii before the Romans really get their hands on it, aren't there?
Oh yeah, no. I mean, we always call the sort of, we can see the Sabines there, we can see various Oscans people, we can identify a little Etruscan influence, a little Greek influence. And so, but that shouldn't really be typical of a sort of port town on the Bay of Naples, which is connected to everywhere.
So, when we're thinking about things like you're talking about an Italian style forum, what sort of things can we say about the public spaces of Pompeii? They sound a little bit like they stand outside of our sort of understanding of something like Rome.
I think we have to, I think there's a scale issue here because Pompeii, you can walk across it in 15 minutes. So you probably walk the equivalent, if you're walking through, I mean, we no longer walk through airports, of course, but if you were walking in an airport, you probably did more walking than you would if you just wanted to cross Pompeii. So it's only 66 hectares, so it's a tiny place. Has a population of we would guess 12,000 people. Some people put it up to 20,000, but when we're sort of looking at the town, we're actually looking at something which is very much so quite early. So the streetscape's quite early. So the paving of the streets was put in the first century BC, and the streets sort of have that very, very narrow feel. You can't pass in two directions in lots of the streets, so that makes sort of the traffic pattern a bit more exciting. And so it's terribly old. So it doesn't look like some of the things of street we see in Rome, for instance, next to the markets of Trajan, which is much wider, or the streets of Ostia, which are very wide. So in a way, it's kind of early Roman urbanism, whereas Ostia and Rome is late Roman urbanism. So it's sort of kicking off because it's preserved in AD 79. You get that feel of this is something which is not quite the same thing, which is Rome in terms of scale. It's not like Ostia, which has much wider streets. And it's not like some of the North African towns either, which have very wide streets. So it's this thing which is sort of like it's a very, very old town.
This sounds like a really interesting problem, perhaps, for Pompeii to have, because one of the things that people tend to say about Pompeii is that it's a trading port. And to have these really sort of confined street patterns seems to maybe present some issues for the people while they're trying to conduct trade. How do you get things in and out easily? How do you move around?
Yeah, I think the whole the trading port aspect is certainly there, but it's not a big port. We're not dealing with something which is big. I mean, if we looked at Puteoli across the Bay of Naples, there we'd have a big port. Or if we look at Portus next to Ostia, that's a really big port. So Pompeii is just this little port. It brings stuff in. We have sort of wine coming from places like Rhodes and the Greek world. We have garum coming from Spain. And so you have lots of things coming into it, but at the same time, it's not a big place. We sort of see it as sort of this is archetypal Roman urbanism, but it's tiny.
So everything's a little bit on a miniature scale. I mean, that makes Pompeii kind of nicer to me in a way. It's kind of like a cute place now.
Yeah, I think Herculaneum's probably cuter, but we don't want to go there. We're trying to stay on Pompeii. I think there's lots of sort of sweet details. I mean, at the same time, the place has 160 bars, for example. So it has a lot of shops, and streets lined with shops are a real Roman innovation, and it's something which the Greek world doesn't really go in for. So that's something which makes it archetypally Roman or Italian. So that gives it a real flavour that you're walking down streets, they're lined with shops, and you feel there that you're in sort of kind of typical European urbanism, really.
So I think that's a really fascinating aspect of what Pompeii offers us in a way, because we can see this sort of slice of what feels like a really familiar kind of lifestyle for us coming from sort of a European background and in sort of settler contexts. And thinking about Pompeii in terms of its public spaces, are there any, you've mentioned the Forum, but are there any other sort of like really notable public spaces in Pompeii that are worth drawing people's attention to?
I think you can, I mean, it depends whether we see baths as public spaces. I mean, this is always the difficult thing. If we just go for sort of piazzas and streets, then we're talking about 17% of the urban space. So it's the equivalent of, I think the exact figure I think it's exactly the same as the amount of green space or garden space in the city. So there's a quite nice parallel there. We also think of the big palaestra next to the amphitheatre, which has a swimming pool in it. It has trees around it. And we know that there was a lot of teaching of children there. There's lots of graffiti of alphabets there. And that sort of real sort of practicing writing letters is all on the columns around there. So there is that sense. And there's one memorable graffito which basically says that as you don't want to pay me as a teacher, I'm off, basically. I'm going. It's just like this graffito. You're not going to pay me, I'm going.
Amen.
It's a lovely teacher's one. So it'd be great for you guys.
Teachers deserve to be paid.
Yes.
So I suppose this leads into an idea of like when we're thinking about what makes something public and what makes something private, this seems to lead into a bigger debate about how we understand public and private spaces generally in the ancient world and how the Romans in particular conceptualized space. And that might be quite different from the way that we think about it today.
Yeah, the Romans divide things into public things like the water fountains in the streets, and also the streets are a public thing. But at the same time, the pavement is actually repaired by the householder who has the property adjoining the street. So there's this kind of mixing of responsibilities. So the pavement is actually almost like part of the house. But if you go in the house, quite a lot of the area we would actually see is going, well, people want people to look into their houses from the doorways, and that there is this idea that you go into the house to see the great man, and that's kind of a public event as well. So in the Roman world, that there's a concept of secret space as well. Like what happens in the cubiculum, the bedroom, is where you have all the plots happening, or at night in houses you have things done in secret. So secret is bad private, whereas doing things in public is ideal. I mean, teaching children would be done in public because you wouldn't actually trust a teacher to be in a room on their own with loads of children because you want them to be observed. So that idea of the sort of distrust of things happening out of sight in the Roman world. So, and in terms of property, of course, you actually own property from the ground upwards. So the idea of you owning an apartment in an apartment block is almost impossible because you have to own the ground that the apartment stands on. So that takes us into a whole world, because we tend to assume when we walk around Pompeii that all the houses are owner occupied. We just have this sort of clique. I mean, maybe it's a British thing, maybe an Australian thing. But in actual fact, quite a few of those houses could be rented out to people. So a big rental market is in the city as well. So that idea of sort of you could be living in a house, but you wouldn't own it. So it's private to you because you rent it, but you don't own that. So that idea of public-private ownership is very strong there.
I'm kind of fascinated by the implications of that as well, particularly for renters. If you've got a high proportion of renters, to what degree do they get to have privacy? At what point is that threshold just permissible for the owner of that piece of land to just cross and enter into that building?
Yeah, I think that there is also the whole thing where you could rent a property and then subdivide it, which we hear about a lot, the rental of rooms in properties, which there is little privacy because you just have the room. You all go through the same doorways, you go up the stairs through somebody's house to get to where your own little private space is. So there's a lot of that sort of occupation going on in the Roman world, certainly.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Thinking about like being back out on the street for a moment, like what do we get a sense from the physical remains of Pompeii about how people are moving around? So we know we've got those narrow streets and we've got those shop fronts. Are there any other aspects that are influencing the way that people are using and moving through that urban space?
Well, I mean, they look terribly modern, the streets of Pompeii, because they've got pavements or sidewalks. And you have the crossing stones, which give you an idea of where people have put things, because they paved the streets and they didn't really put in a sort of stormwater devices under the streets. So the streets are actually basically gutters as well. They're like canal. And what the streets become during very wet weather is they become like water channels, which is why we have the famous stepping stones to keep your feet out of the wet. So the placement of the stepping stones gives us quite a good idea of movement itself. We also have to think about stopping as well as just moving through the streets, because we tend to think of streets and traffic, but the street is a place for a lot of interaction. So we find little shrines to in local deities. In Rome, we call them the Lares Compitales, and we very definitely, the Lares protect the neighborhood. And we find those close to crossroads, sometimes tucked in a side street. We also have water fountains at the crossroads. So the crossroads sort of accumulates not just traffic turning, but also people doing things. So if you want to get water, you go to the crossroads. If you want to worship, you go to the crossroads. If you start looking for where the alphabets are, quite a lot of those are set up next to crossroads where children are practicing writing their letters. So that idea of stopping is quite important, because slowing, like the crossroads slows you down. The other thing which we do have for understanding direction, a lot of the side streets are blocked off. So, and there is also a giant change of level halfway up Via dell'Abbondanza, close to the Stabian Bars, where it's literally 1.5 meters, a level change, which means no traffic across that way. We also find, and this is sort of the famous wheel ruts of Pompeii, which are, Eric Poehler at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst has spent at least 20 years studying them and measuring them in every way. But that gives us sort of an idea of direction. And he's also found where the axle of the cart rubbed against the cornerstones to actually see which is the directional movement as well. So he started mapping out. And this was originally presented as a one-way system for Pompeii, but it's a certain sense of knowing which streets are easier to navigate. But a lot of householders were actually blocking side streets to stop cart traffic going past them. But a lot of traffic would be on donkeys, on mules, without pulling any vehicles itself. So there's a lot of animal movement or on foot movement as well.
This is fantastic. I think the level of detail to which the archaeological record can offer us these sorts of insights is just incredibly fascinating. And this work on wheel ruts just sounds amazing to me in terms of getting into the intricacies of how things are moving around in that space.
There's a whole thing in terms of you can plot repair. And one of the most extraordinary things he's found was that he found splashes of iron, molten iron, in the wheel ruts, as well as sort of slag in the wheel ruts. And it would seem at some point the Romans were trying to repair the wheel ruts by pouring molten iron in them. Now, that's actually a really strange concept, because
I wonder how long that would have lasted.
To heat up iron, you need an awful lot of heating material, but they saw that as easier than cutting the stone and replacing the stone. So it is one of those most extraordinary things, but there are hundreds of these little splashes of iron next to a lot of wheel ruts. So it's fairly clear that they were doing this as a sort of technological experiment, which obviously didn't work.
Oh, that's a real shame. And also, I could just imagine that if maybe it did work to a certain extent, and then somebody along came in the night and maybe chipped one out and took it away for their own benefit. But I imagine if people saw them, they'd get into trouble.
Yeah.
Thinking about the sort of the layers that we have at Pompeii when we're thinking about the streets and the public spaces, how have things changed over time? Is there much distinction that we can tell from the different levels of excavation?
I think the thing which we can tell more of, because nobody's really dug a great big hole through a street yet. There's a piece of work which has been done on the Forum, because the Forum is changed in terms of quite a lot of it. A lot of the streets are blocked off. And what was found in that piece of work was the entire orientation of the city was changed by the blocking of the streets into the Forum. Previously, we see the Forum today as something which is almost put to one side of the main streets, whereas previously a lot of streets ran through it from a west to east or east to west direction, straight through the Forum. And they got blocked off. By doing that, they completely changed the sort of the pattern of traffic flow in the city. And the Forum became this sort of enclosed space, whereas previously it'd been very open to traffic. And that change is probably one of the most staggering changes to the city. And it was done by just intricate work on thinking through, well, what's the implication of blocking a street? And we find this occasionally in the modern world, where there was a street in Paris which was blocked off by one small local council, and it completely disrupted people's commute into Paris. So just moving just one sort of bit of the traffic system slightly can cause these big changes. But in Pompeii, it's very clear when they started shutting off the east-west axes into the Forum, that they completely changed the nature of traffic flow. They reduced the traffic flow, because a grid of streets in a way is the most open for multiple routes of any structure of any form of street planning. Therefore, by closing it, you're actually concentrating traffic and human interaction on a number of streets. So you're changing a sort of even pattern in something which is really concentrated. And it's as though urbanism actually needs that concentration, because if you actually disperse people evenly across a grid plan, urbanism doesn't really work. It starts fragmenting. People start feeling isolated, where that close togetherness and that sort of intensity is quite an important thing.
So in a way, it sounds like perhaps by closing that road down, they've created the opportunity for different types of interactions and maybe a different sense of relationship, particularly to the Forum and how they navigate it.
So, certainly to the Forum. The Forum becomes a much more enclosed place, a much more formal space. It doesn't have carts running through it. It doesn't have people running through it. It becomes almost like formalized, and some of the architecture, which, I mean, you think of all the columns and some of the temples around, I mean, sort of multiple temples in the Forum by the Julio-Claudian period. Then we're seeing something which is sort of a formal space, but a space which is enclosed, a space which is quite controlled. Whereas previously, you could see, well, if you can drive straight through it, that's actually almost like that's a very different form of urbanism. It's rather like, if you take people to Naples, you sort of suddenly see this intensity of traffic. It's almost like that difference compared with driving around Sydney, for example, which is the most leisurely experience it can possibly be.
Oh, don't tell Sydney-siders that. They'll never believe you.
I must admit, I feel like I'm getting a bit of Sydney vibes from listening to you talk about Pompeii. One-way streets and narrow streets that you can only go down in one direction. It's sounding all too familiar.
So if we're thinking about, as a wrap-up to thinking about streets and spaces, what would you say are some of the biggest advantages and challenges of studying this kind of idea within the context of Pompeii, thinking about urban space and thinking about the streets in particular?
I think the big challenge is you can't go and talk to people about what they did. I mean, that's the biggest challenge. You actually want to, if you do urban studies in the modern world, you do surveys, you follow people around, whereas we actually have no people. So having no people, we have to do everything from material culture. So we plot everything. We plot all the graffiti, where people wrote more graffiti and less graffiti. And then we've looked at the wheel ruts. We've mapped all the benches, the water fountains, the street shrines. We've mapped everything. But there's a point where you almost go, well, how does it all work? How many people live in that house? And that causes you to be completely stuck. You can see that's a bigger house, but how many people were in it? Well, we don't know. And that's where we get into this worry. And we can see some streets have more shops in them and openings, doorway openings. And that gives us an idea of something which is busier. But at the same time, what does that do? And what's the timing of streets as well? We can do some things from literary sources that, yes, the shops open at the 3rd hour and the baths are really populated at the 8th hour and things like that. But we don't have that sense of sort of going, well, what is a normal day in Pompeii? And we don't have that sense of going, how does it work in terms of imagination of sort of putting people back into the city itself?
Yeah, I think it's really important to highlight that, because so often when you open up books about Pompeii, you will be presented with an account of a day in Pompeii, and it will go through, this is what you would do in the morning, and this is what you would do around lunchtime, and this is what you do in the afternoon. And as you say, whilst you might be able to generalize to a certain extent, it's good to highlight just how much confusion I think there is and how many possibilities there are for what life was actually like on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and I think that it's also going, well, how often were the elite actually in Pompeii? I mean, we know that the Senate in Rome met once a month. So we have imagination. It's sort of every. When I was a student reading about the Roman Republic, I thought, well, Cicero must be going to the Senate every day. He seems really busy about it. But in actual fact, they get most of the stuff done in once a month sitting. So what does that mean in terms of what do you do the rest of the time? There's things like law courts and all of those things are going on. But what, like this is actually fairly low government level.
Sounds maybe more relaxing to be part of the elite in the ancient world.
Yes.
So thinking now about how confusing it is to try and piece together day-to-day life, we're going to turn to one of the groups that's perhaps the most difficult, I think, to chart in the ancient Roman world. And that includes in a city like Pompeii, which is being preserved, in such a different way to other towns. But that is children. So children are very tricky to track down in the archaeological record. And you've highlighted in your own work that when we study a place like Pompeii, we tend to see Pompeii from the perspective of adults because children leave less of a track that we can actually, pin down and trace in the archaeological record, in the literary record. And even when we're talking about things like human remains, bones in their bodies are much more delicate and prone to either be dispersed or decay over time. So it's so hard to know what it would be like to be a child in Pompeii. But you've really made this an area of study.
Yeah, I think I was, well, having written a book about Pompeii, which didn't include children, you just like go, well, children constitute half the population. Okay, so the ancient world, demographically, that would be the model we'd go. So 50% of the population is under 18. 7% of the population is over 60, roughly the same number of adults as today, sort of between 18 and 60. And if you think that through, you've got to explain how urbanism works for children. Also, how do they learn urbanism? And what's the process whereby you know what to do when you walk down the street? That whole process, or how do you learn your lesson? And the thing which was, I think there are about 100 graffiti of alphabets across Pompeii. And this started me thinking about that. And also there's some fantastic work by someone called Catherine Huntley, where she looked at all the figurative graffiti. A lot of them are in primary schools. We do this. We get children to draw a stick drawing of themselves in probably year 3 or 4. They also exist in Pompeii, and they're exactly the same as the ones which you would get from a primary school child today or anywhere else. Because in the 1960s, anthropologists went around the world to find people who hadn't had contact with the West and got them to draw images of what they thought themselves looked like. You have big hands, typically big heads, for example. Long arms is another trait. And these are being categorized according to age. And Catherine Huntley did this fantastic piece of work on just sort of looking at like, how do these show stages of development? How tall are they off the floor? So you can give a rough idea of, you tend to naturally, if you're going to draw on a wall, you tend to go for eye level. You can try this out for yourselves later and tell me I'm wrong. Because when you say this to somebody, go, no, I do it right down by my waist. And go, well, no, you wouldn't, because you've got to be able to see to write the thing. And especially if you're learning to write, because most of the graffiti from Pompeii are just somebody's name. So I think the exciting thing about graffiti is not what they say, but the fact that somebody stood there in the ancient world and did that writing. That action of writing is probably one of the sort of urban phenomenons which we take for granted because we want to read what the writing says. But it's actually the writing itself, that somebody stood there 2,000 years ago or more and just wrote their name, or wrote an insult to somebody, or wrote an alphabet because they were trying to learn their letters. And that to me gives the sort of real insight. But you can see how tall things are. So some of the very low down graffiti we tend to associate with children. So from there, I started to sort of think through, well, could children serve a drink at a bar in Pompeii? Could they go up to a bar and ask for a drink? Because that's actually quite difficult in Australia, in the UK, because bars typically are built to be tall so that people don't jump over them and assault the barman. Or children can't be served. I mean, it depends how you see it. And what we found is that they were they're about 60 centimeters in height. They're really low. So compared with your kitchen counter, they would be, for us, because we're very tall, a female in Pompeii is 1 meter 54 on average, and male is 1 meter 66. So they are fairly small people. Interestingly, in the 1960s, the average height of Neapolitans was lower than that, which is one of the things that they've all grown since then. But the thing which you can do, you can actually start looking at the height of things. Can you go to a water fountain if you're a child and get some water and take it home? Well, the answer is yes, because they're not very tall. The other thing you can use, because we know how tall the adults are, you can use things like human growth charts as a proxy to see how tall somebody was at any age. And human growth charts are given to every parent who has child born certainly in the UK, based on a study of, I think, of children in Boston in the 1970s. So they're a little bit off.
Sounds helpful.
But you suddenly look at those and look at the sort of Pompeian heights. Well, they're actually the lowest percentile of our modern world. They're the shortest people in the modern world, would be the average Pompeian. But human growth is quite linear. It can be interrupted through disease, which we know from the study of teeth in Pompeii, that there are lots of episodes where people are so ill with a very, very high temperature for 2 weeks that they don't produce calcium. So they get these striations on bones and on their teeth. And the teeth can be measured and dated to roughly at what age they had that period of disease where they just stopped producing calcium. They basically shut down and stop growing because they're so ill. So that gives us quite a lot of data. And you suddenly realize, well, we've actually got quite a lot here. And if you start looking at the city as though, well, if you were this high as a child, could you do this? You can start sort of understanding that. I think the parallel for this is also what happens in terms of aging in later life. This is something which there's quite a bit of debate around sort of disability studies in the ancient world starting up over the last decade. And one of the things is, well, most people who are old are going to have eyesight problems just because that's what happens. So how do they use the city in those conditions? Because it's fairly difficult to get around currently. And the archaeological authorities in Pompeii have done all sorts of things to try and make the site more accessible to disabled people, blind people, etc. So how that group of people, aging is pretty vicious on the eyesight. I think it's something which we are very conscious of. I have several colleagues terrified that they go blind. And so that really sort of promotes this idea of sort of going, well, how do you deal with this city? Because we've got the artifacts, so we can start talking about, well, how does a blind person go through Pompeii, or how does a child go through Pompeii? Because we've got the urban environment to understand it. We just need to actually sort of think through what humans do in those environments.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really intrigued me as I was having a look through some of the work that you've published on this is that Pompeii seems to have been actually a lot more accessible to children of a younger age than I actually would have thought. You know, it seems like whether you're talking about religious rites or, as you were just highlighting before, you know, going into a bar, accessing a water fountain, they actually would have been younger than I would have assumed potentially in terms of being able to see what was going on or appreciate what was going on, and therefore learning about their own culture by experiencing that urban environment.
Yeah, I think logically, if half the population are children, well, they have to be able to access the urban environment, or it doesn't work. And that's a kind of sort of fundamental. And the thing which I got quite interested in, there's a whole set of studies of middle childhood from about 8 to 13 of what do children do at that period. Well, they tend to go off and get lost largely. And rather than staying very close to adults, they tend to go and explore. And that exploration, I think, is quite an interesting concept of how far do you go away from the home. And you can go, how do you go to somebody else's house? That's somebody else's house in somewhere else. That idea of going, how do you navigate the streets? Because most tourists tend to get lost when they get to Pompeii because they can't get out because they don't know the way. They have sort of panics about that. But how do you learn the way to certain places, or how do you learn that going down that street takes you to such and such? So that kind of comes into it, I think.
And children going to school as well. Like, are they picking up friends along the way? Are they being dropped off, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things which we're fairly uncertain of. Or does the teacher just go round to the houses and round them all up and take them to where he wants them? Because he can have them anywhere. I mean, there are schools which are said to be at the end of alleyways or in public space always, rather than in something which is shut in. So that's actually a sort of intriguing thing. And we do have some election notices which says the teacher and his pupils want you to vote for so-and-so. So there is a certain solidarity there.
And there are, of course, some very interesting pieces of information that have been left behind about children even maybe being involved in politics. So notoriously, the Temple of Isis, when it was damaged by the earthquake that happened in around 62 or 63 CE, was rebuilt by a 6-year-old.
Yeah, I'm he's a town councillor. So, and we do know of there's an 8-year-old and there's another one as well from the same family who were both on the town council when they were children. And you get into this thing of going, well, how do they go to the meetings? Like, do they walk independently if they're 6 years old? Do they get sort of taken to some point in Pompeii and then you've got to walk the other way, and then you've got to sit through all this boring crap the adults are going on about? So that they're not unique, that 6-year-old. So that there's several of them that we know of, and you're just like going, well, presumably there's some dressing up and performance of this. And how does that 6-year-old walk down the street or go to the Temple of Isis and going, oh, it's him? Because the inscription itself is also intriguing, because I think it's set up, the inscription is set up when he's an adult. Because reading it logically, it doesn't make any sense that the inscription's been set up when he's 6 years old.
Right.
It sort of looks as though, and thinking that because there's 17 years between the earthquake and the eruption. So in that period, that inscription's got to be set up at some point. So let's say he's 6 in 62 AD. Then if he's 17 years older at the eruption, he's then 23. And that's just the point where you start standing to be an aedile. So it might be sort of, you can actually see, well, sort of, yep, he's 6 years old then, and then he's much older when the eruption happens, but he's not really an adult even. So through that entire period, he's grown up as a child, as a town councillor.
I find that so fascinating because Dr. G and I have definitely tried on some traditional Roman clothing, and we couldn't even stand in it elegantly, let alone move through a Roman or a Pompeian cityscape without looking like total fools. And I'm just so intrigued by that idea as well, because in the Roman world, what you wear is also supposed to, signify your status to a certain extent. But the idea of people being able to see this little 6-year-old potentially going off to his town council meeting, maybe all dressed up. And I kind of have this image of a 6-year-old being like, Dad, you're so embarrassing. Just leave me alone. Let me go to the council by myself.
Yeah, no. And it's also, you're meant to walk slowly. This is the sort of the whole walking is also performative in the sense that you don't want to be rushing around, because that's what a slave does. And children are allowed to rush around. But obviously the 6-year-old being dressed in a toga to go to the town council meeting has to walk like a town councillor, or learn to walk like a town councillor. So that's like, because obviously mistakes have got to be made in this if you're a child. So you've got to get it wrong. But a lot of being a Roman adult is about not getting it wrong in two different ways, which are contradictory. So you could walk too fast, but then you could just be slow, so that you could too slow. So
I wonder about how a child ends up as a town councillor, though.
They rebuild the Temple of Isis, Dr. G.
This does seem relatively outside of the bounds of what adults might reasonably accept from their governance structures.
Yeah, the thing is, there's once you start looking for it's like anything you start looking for in the ancient world, you either don't find it at all, or you find enough of it to suggest it's not completely unknown. So the 6-year-old in the Temple of Isis is not so weirdly out there that it's not unknown in other places. So I think every so often you have the aberration. The other children who are town councillors, they are from one of Pompeii's most wealthy families. So, but this one's different because he's meant to be a son of a freed slave, although the argumentation around that can go both ways. But let's say he is for the moment. Then he's the freed slave can't be in the town council, so the child is meant to be some sort of proxy for the freed slave, because the exclusion of freed slaves from politics is one of those things that the Romans do, but that their children are perfectly legitimate for being involved in politics.
And I love the fact that you also have highlighted that when we're thinking about the experiences of these children, that we would have to think about obviously more than just what they can see. It's also about that combination of their senses that they would be using, their touch, their hearing, their sense of smell, all of that kind of stuff would go into their lived experience. But it's so hard to trace in the evidence.
I think there's a lovely thing in the Petronius's Satyricon where one of the freed slaves said that he can read capital letters but not cursive script and he says that he learns them from inscriptions, right? So, and if you look at the height of the inscription letters, they are actually really low down. Intriguingly, my youngest son, when he was very small, because street signs in the UK aren't way up where they are in Sydney, they're down low. They're actually at child height at the end of the road, so you basically can't see them when you turn the corner. But for him, he used to stop at every single one and trace the letters, and was learning to read without actually any aid from adults. We had to stop at every single corner because we had the letters on every single one every single time. But that process, that's just like his brother didn't even see the stuff, but some humans will actually learn through that process. So that process of touch is quite important, sort of very tactile, very, very small child. But that just shows you how that can work through. So when we look, we get quite a lot of evidence. And it's also, then you start worrying, well, we always assume that all this archaeology is about adults. And we actually have to include because we've looked in the past for things which are definitely toys that must be about children, but then we discovered that adults make ritual deposits of miniature objects. There's a lot of work on miniature objects in the ancient world now, and they can be used ritually to represent much bigger objects by adults, so they're not toys. And once you get out of that hurdle, you're then getting into the world of going, okay, so all of this stuff can actually be used by everybody. So what we assume is adults' material culture is actually children's material culture as well, and we can't differentiate the two because we don't know who's using it. And that becomes quite an intriguing thing. And the way children use material culture is quite different as well. So in terms of just dropping things, for example, rather than putting them away is classic.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that, if we sort of think about the spatial elements of this relationship between adults and children as well, one of the things about that relationship in Pompeii is that they don't really seem to have specific spaces that are just for children, as we might have in our modern towns. Like we don't really see specific nurseries or playrooms and that sort of thing for children in Pompeii, do we?
I think we have the large palaestra, which you start worrying about this almost immediately because it's got a great big swimming pool in the middle. I don't think the Romans had a really concept of a swimming pool fence. I think this is sort of possible. But that seems to be a place where children certainly spent quite a lot of recreation time. And there are a number of palaestras which are associated with youth groups, for example, the Juvenes. And that form of sort of physical recreation combined with intellectual recreation, of the combining of philosophy at the same time as sport. And I think it's Agricola. Tacitus says that his mother taught him not to drink too heavily out of the cup of philosophy, which is bad for young people. But of course, the Stoicism comes from old people always. It's always the old writers who write, the Stoics, the survival of the old age. But that concept of places where groups meet together, I think there's quite a lot of that going on. I think also that the street is one great big social thing. I mean, you just think of Via dell'Avandanza, it's just lined by shops after shops with bars, and then the houses are entrances, houses are interspersed between it. That's actually a sort of that's the place where children and adults go.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that always surprises my students, because we tend to get very caught up, as you say, on the buildings and the houses and what was going on inside. But you have to remind them that there really would have been a very bustling street life, especially for people that didn't live in fancy, spacious houses, because not everybody in Pompeii did have a nice atrium type house.
No, exactly. I mean, a lot of people were living in their shop, and that's all they had, and that's very, very limiting. I think the reason for lots of bars is because people wanted hot food and also cooler drinks as well.
Absolutely. And I just want to highlight one particular piece of evidence which always gets brought up when it comes to places like Pompeii, because we actually have access to human remains. And recently, I believe there have actually even been a few finds of children's bodies, even I think a pregnant woman who was carrying I think it was a 36-week-old fetus. What do the human remains tell us about children's lives in terms of, were they working heavy labor? Was that a common experience for children as far as we can tell, or are there not enough to really make any generalizations?
Right, there are lots and lots of fetuses found in Pompeii because the pregnant women couldn't run away in AD 79. It's one of those rather real disproportion of fetuses were found in the skeletal remains. The children themselves, the problem with skeletal evidence is to get any wear into bones which are growing, because bones are growing and you don't get the wear coming into them in childhood. They tend to be, but I mean, the health and teeth thing is very strong. That being ill as a child, like seriously ill, was a very common experience. And we think about half of all the people who are born would die before they're adult in the Roman world. So illness, sickness, and death would actually characterize childhood. And the ones which survive are those who are going to be adults. And if you think that, I think explaining it to one of your classes would be, well, half of you would be dead by now, to a group of year 12. I think it's a very graphic way of explaining the death rate in childhood in the ancient world.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. Ooh, well, that's certainly given us a lot to think about. And I think to sort of just start to draw our conversation to a close, I think one of the things that you've highlighted really well in talking about both the spatial environment of Pompeii and also the lived experience for the people of Pompeii is that there are some intriguing things that can be highlighted about Roman culture from these places, but at the same time, it is a unique place that was destroyed at a very particular point in time. And we also have to be careful about perhaps how much we generalize from a site like this.
I think it's also, there's a sort of trick. I mean, it is quite unique. It's very difficult to compare to other places. And somebody will always turn around and go, well, Pompeii is completely unique, so it can't be true of anywhere else. Which, I mean, it used to be an interview question I used to have for jobs. So you just like go, oh no, it's that question again. But there's also this feeling, there's a certain disquiet when we study Pompeii sometimes, because it is a place where an awful lot of people died in AD 79. And you sometimes get, that can be quite distressing of going, well, how should we treat the dead from the eruption of Vesuvius? Because I think I was looking at the British Museum exhibition of casts, and you're just finding that this is actually really macabre and sensationalizing. And you're just like going, well, how do we get that balance of, we always treat human beings today who are alive in a certain way. We probably need to treat the dead with sort of similar sorts of respect.
I think it's a very good point, though, because this is an increasingly broad discussion that I think is happening across particularly museum culture as well, is navigating remains and also the repatriation of remains as well. And so to be in a spot like Pompeii and to be seeing that kind of evidence and to navigate it, thinking about what is going to be the legacy of where these pieces ultimately end up, I mean, there's a human being with a life there. And I think it's important to not forget that. And I think it's impressive that's at the forefront of your thinking as well.
Yeah, no, it's something which you're just like going, well, how do we treat the ancient world with the same levels of respect that we have for the modern world? It's something which I've noticed a change in the way we treat we treat Caligula, for instance. We used to call him the Mad Emperor, but we no longer do that. We actually try and, you've got to explain what that actually means to the Roman world and what does it mean to us to say that, because how does that characterize people with mental illness today? Because it just simply doesn't work. And I think it's quite a nice example of how we're shifting in our own thinking of how we teach and how we explain things.
Yeah, I must admit, I think my own attitude towards the sites and the bodies has changed even with time. I think when I talk to my students about Pompeii, obviously a lot, and we have to talk about human remains as one of the syllabus dot points. And I find that they do tend to be quite frustrated by that syllabus dot point, because they're like, it happened so long ago, get over it. Why are we talking about this? And I can understand that, because I think when I was their age as well, I did kind of look at the cast as being like a statue. That's kind of how they appeared to me.
Mm.
But now when I look at them, and I look at particularly, I mean, given what we've been talking about, particularly the cast where you've got the child with the parent kind of melded together in this odd final position, it does actually affect you more, I think, when you're older and you have a family of your own. And I don't know, I think your sensibilities can also change over time, just within your own lifetime, just from personal experience, but also obviously those broader conversations.
Yeah. No, definitely.
Well, thank you so much for stopping by to talk about Pompeii with us. Before we go, I'll ask you one final question, which is, do you have any insights about any of the recent finds from Reggio 5? Because I believe that one of them was actually some graffiti that's believed to be done by a child. So I thought that would be right up your alley.
Yeah, there is. What you have to get hold of, and I haven't yet, is Massimo Asana's book, which is going to be published in English. I was thinking about 2 months ago, I must order an Italian copy, and then forgot to order it. But there is so much, and I think what you see there is actually sort of the freshness of the colors. I mean, I think the TV programs about the bar was quite remarkable. And then they've got this weird chariot burial outside Pompeii as well, which they found, which is even stranger. So lots of things which are pretty challenging.
Absolutely. Well, we'll have to put that on our to-buy list. Dr. G might even order it in the Italian, given that she is always trying to improve her understanding.
Yeah, always trying to improve my Italian. Yes.
Right,
yeah.
It's good to try it. Try is important. Viene, try.
Yeah. Always piano piano con la pratica.
Well, we're so grateful for you for talking to us about Pompeii today, and of course to the wonderful department at Macquarie University, to which we owe a lot of our education and our enthusiasm for ancient history, and what you also do for our own students in the years since we've been at university ourselves. And if you're interested, of course, you can have very easy access to some of Ray Laurence's work by just going and checking out his TED Ed videos about what life would be like for children in the ancient Roman world.
Well, thank you.
Is there anything you would like to plug before we sign off?
I don't think I've got anything to plug at the moment.
Disappointing.
You plug the animations. So no, I think there is going to be a book on the cultural history of shopping coming next year, but it's just been finished, so it's going to take about a year for it to come out. But that will be good. Right? All about shopping.
I don't know. It sounds like just what the modern world was crying out for as well.
Yeah,
absolutely. And we are very grateful that you also did join us whilst we were in lockdown, because of course the irony of us speaking to someone who we actually have physical access to and having to do it online has not escaped any of us, I'm sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of typical of lockdown. It has to happen, really. It's like, well, you just like going, why do we arrange so many things for that week?
It is very frustrating, but we're glad that we're still able to chat to you.
Okay.